Okay, let's see if this is live and see how it sounds. YouTube. YouTube Studio. I always get so confused here. Oh, we're live right now. Let's take a look and see if this is a real deal. Yeah. Cool. So, welcome, folks. Welcome to this live stream. This is your friendly neighborhood video game design professor, John, coming to you live from New York City. Apologies for the screaming kids outside. It's recess. I hope you're all doing well this week. Lots happening in the world, but I hope that you are staying grounded, taking care of yourselves, your loved ones, and taking care of your game design chops, because that's what we're here to do. We're here to focus on making video games, and I'm here to show you some cool new things in the world, the wonderful world of Godot. Today's exciting because we get to jump into the world of the third dimension, okay? The whole semester we've spent really just mainly hanging out in the second dimension, but today we're going all the way into the third dimension, which is oh my god, yeah, there's a lot of screaming outside. I'm just gonna keep going, and I'm assuming that it's not that bad on the microphone. So we're going to jump into 3D, and 3D is really, really fun and really cool, and what's wonderful about 3D and Godot is that it's very accessible, okay? Everything that we've been doing in 2D translates really, really easily into 3D, okay? So hopefully there's not too much of a learning curve for 3D, because again, all of the stuff that we've been doing, a lot of the same nodes that you've been working with in your 2D projects are translated one-to-one into 3D. So, I hope you find this enjoyable. I'm going to go over an overall overview of how to use 3D in Godot. I'm also going to show you the Lab 4 requirements up front, because it's good to sort of keep those in mind while we're going over 3D, and you can, by watching this video, you should be well equipped to do Lab 4. Lab 4 should be really straightforward. It's just sort of assembling a simple 2D scene, or 3D scene, much like what we did for Lab 1. Okay, I think Lab 4 is similar in complexity to Lab 1, so it should be pretty fun. But we're going to cover 3D nodes, including constructive solid geometry shapes, cameras, and I think I'm also just going to go further today, since this is going to stand in for a couple of chunks of course material. We're also going to cover materials, models, textures, and maybe even some lights and sound. So it should be pretty fun. Buckle up. And without any further ado, we'll get started. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the GitHub repository to show you the Lab 4 requirements. Using the FCLC Lab 4 requirements for Fordham, but if you're at SVA or elsewhere, this is the assignment is the same in both projects. So for Lab 4, what we want to have is I want to show you the thing. Okay, you just want to have look at it, I even have a typo here. It should say 3D Godot project that has a GitHub repository, a 3D scene with a camera, a light source, and a simple level made with CSG shapes, and a controllable character body 3D. Okay, so these are the criteria for Lab 4. And without any further ado, I'll show you how to accomplish that, as well as I'll give you a dive, an introduction into 3D and Godot. So I'm just going to switch over to Godot and launch the engine. I'll create a new project. I'll call it Hello 3D. And I will just save that there for now. I am going to actually switch to, you can do 3D in any of the renderers, okay? It exports really nicely onto the web with a compatibility renderer, but if we're going to do lights and textures and materials and stuff, you know, it might be nice to use the fancy Forward Plus renderer. So I'm actually just going to switch to the Forward Plus renderer for advanced 3D graphics. You don't need to do that to do any of this, but I'm going to do that for fun. And then I'm just going to hit create and edit. And now what's really sort of wonderful about starting off in 3D is that we don't have to switch tabs anymore, okay? By default, we get spawned into the 3D tab and we can finally start playing around with it. As a matter of fact, there's actually two tabs up here that we haven't really looked at much this semester, right? We spent a lot of time in the 2D tab and the script tab, but we haven't looked at the 3D tab. We also haven't really looked at the asset library, and I'm actually just gonna do a quick, before we really dive into 3D, I'm just going to show you around the asset library really quick. Sorry, I just wanted to check my stream. Yeah, okay. If you haven't checked out the asset library, it's really worth doing so. There's a lot of really powerful tools in here. There's like, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different levels worth of pages of, actually, let's go all the way to the end. There's actually 40 pages worth of plugins for the Godot game engine. And plugins are a really powerful way to both extend the power of the engine and to give it even more functionality. There's also a lot of good assets in the asset library that you can use in prototyping your games and stuff. And as a matter of fact, a little bit later, I will use some of these KKit prototype bits, I think, in order to make some 3D stuff. So if you haven't checked out the asset library, I recommend doing so. I didn't tell you about it until now because I figure, you know, for the first project, it's really good to try and figure out how to build everything yourself. But there's lots of really good plugins for accomplishing things like, you know, dialogue boxes, dialogue trees, certain types of enemy systems. There's all sorts of really helpful tools in here. So definitely take a peek in here. But for now, I'm going to switch to this other new tab, the 3D tab. Okay, and here in the 3D tab, you'll see we have a bunch of things. For starters, I have, oh, let me bring up my key presses. I think it's called Any Key. Show me the key. Show me the key. I'm going to make this turned on. And I don't know why I have those weird borders. That's fine. I'm going to make this just floating on top so that way you can see what I'm pressing while I'm pressing it. Okay, so here we are in the 3D editor, and you know, if you just click with the left mouse button, you'll use the selection dialog. It's not really like the sort of drag and drop thing. This doesn't really help you orient or navigate your way through 3D. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to use your right mouse button. And I recommend for 3D trying to get a standalone mouse with a couple buttons. You can also use a touchpad or a trackpad. That'll work fine too, but it just makes it a little bit easier. Okay, so if you press the right mouse button and drag, you will rotate your camera around kind of like you're on a tripod, okay? So you can look up and down, and you'll notice, right, we can't go further up than 90 degrees or further down than 90 degrees. So if you press the right mouse button and drag, you will sort of rotate around in place, okay? If you have a scroll wheel, you can scroll to zoom in and out, okay? You can also press the middle mouse button and drag to orbit around. Okay, that's kind of different from the right mouse button, right? As you'll see, if I'm pressing the right mouse button, I'm just sort of orbiting in place. I'm rotating in place. But if I'm pressing the middle mouse button and dragging, it's like I'm rotating around the point I'm looking at. Okay. Another really fun way to navigate 3D is to press down the right mouse button and then to start using the W, A, S, and D keys to move up, down, left, and right. You can also use Q to go down and E to go up. Okay, so you can sort of like fly around like you're a god in a third-dimensional world. Okay, you can also, if you feel like you're not navigating fast enough, you can hold Shift to sprint, and then when you press W, A, S, and D, you'll move a little bit faster. Okay, so that's pretty fun. It's a pretty nice way to navigate. What else can I show you? You'll notice up in the top right we have this gizmo that spins around whenever I spin around, right? So if I look to the left, you'll see that this gizmo sort of spins around this way, and when I look to the right, it spins around that way. This is like a quick way to orient yourself in 3D. So you can always also grab the gizmo and drag it to sort of rotate around any of those axes. What's also nice is you can also click any of the circles and you'll snap to exactly that position on the axis, okay? Like a perfect version of this. So like right now, for instance, I'm pressing the Y button, so I'm looking directly down on the Y axis. And I guess I should probably mention, right, we should talk about these axes, right? In 2D, we've had 2 axes all semester long, right? If we go back to our classic 2D view, we have Y is up and down, and X is left and right. And X is the blue, or X is red, right? Left and right. Y is green, it's up and down. And in 3D, we have a third axis. We have this blue axis, the Z axis, and that's depth, right? If we sort of orient ourselves kind of in our sort of traditional way, you'll notice we still have red as our X axis, which goes from left to right. We still have Y is our green axis, which goes up and down. But then we also have this Z axis, which is blue, and that's forwards and backwards, right? So again, it's very similar to 2D, except we have a different axis to work along, okay? And so when we're using these buttons, this allows us to sort of look at almost like a 2-dimensional view because we've perfectly aligned ourselves along one axis. So for instance, if I perfectly align myself along the Y axis, all we really see to work with is the Z axis, right? We have X and Z. But if I, for instance, if I perfectly align myself along the Z axis, you'll see that we only have this X and Y coordinate, and that looks very similar in some sense to our 2D view, okay? Now, this is all a little bit abstract, so I think we should probably start adding some things to our scene in order to start building out a slightly more complicated thing that we can actually look at and interact with, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and add a node, and as you'll see, right, we have 3 fundamental node types in Godot, and we've only been using 2 so far, but we're gonna use this third type now, the 3D nodes, okay? All 3D nodes in Godot are red, and just like in 2D, how there's a regular node 2D, there's also just a regular node 3D. And just like node 2D, node 3D is just an empty point in space, okay? So node 3D has the same transformation properties as node 2D, except you'll see that at the end, there's an extra value for the Z component, okay? So there's an X position, a Y position, and a Z position now, along with an X rotation, Y rotation, Z rotation, an X scale, Y scale, and a Z scale, okay? But aside from that, aside from having literally just an extra number at the end, they basically are identical, okay? So you can sort of move points around in 3D space. The gizmo's a little bit different, right? Obviously, we have 3 different axes here, and we have this whole roundy thing. The roundy thing is good for rotating, okay? Which you can't really see because, again, we're just sort of rotating an empty point in space, right? So let me actually add something that you can see to the scene to, like, you know, to actually start rotating stuff. Okay, so I'm gonna add I'll add a new node. I'll just drag our image into the scene. Does this work? No, this doesn't work. Okay, it's not as easy as that in order to make a sprite 3D, but there is a thing called a sprite 3D, as a matter of fact, so I will just add a sprite 3D, okay? And a sprite 3D is exactly the same as the sprite 2D, except it's in the 3rd dimension, okay? So here's our sprite 3D, there it is, and you'll notice that a sprite 3D is just like a flat image in 3D space, right? And it works exactly the same way as our sprite 2D. And so now when I move things around, right, I can move things along the x-axis, and we'll see that we have these transformation properties, right? As I move it here, you'll notice that the x number is changing, the x component is changing. If I drag it up and down, you'll notice that the y component is changing, and if I drag it forwards and backwards, you'll notice that the z component is changing, okay? And now that we have something that we can actually see on screen, I can also show you how the rotation works. So I can grab this circular edge and drag it around to rotate it. You'll notice that I think if you also hold down Control or maybe Command on Mac, it will rotate on a sort of snapped axis. It'll rotate on nice, clear, even degrees, which is kind of handy. So you can use this blue circle to rotate along the Z axis. You can use the red circle to rotate around the X axis. You can use the green circle to rotate around the Y-axis, right? And as you sort of start to play around with 3D, you know, it gets a little confusing at first to try and tell, you know, which axes and things you're rotating around. But you can kind of think about it like, I don't know, sometimes when we zoom out and kind of have this sort of bird's eye perspective, it's a little bit easier to tell, right? This green circle lets you know that we're rotating around the y-axis, right, which goes up and down. So if I were to drag this guy, you can see it's rotating around in a circle, right? Whereas like the blue axis, let's see if I can get back to where I was. It's sometimes you get a little disoriented in 3D. So you can always use the arrow keys to fly around. You can also, if you get totally lost in 3D, let's say I'm looking somewhere else and I'm like, oh gosh, where's my node? You can always click on the node in the node tree, go to the viewport and press F, and it'll zoom the camera right back to it. That also works in 2D, but typically we don't need it as often in 2D. But so anyway, right, if I'm right here looking along the z-axis, you can see now when I grab this blue circle, I'm rotating it around that axis. Okay, so that's kind of our sort of how some of the fundamental transformation properties work in 3D. And just like nodes in 2D, nodes in 3D all inherit properties and stuff from their parents, right? So if I were to duplicate this node and make it a child of this node, right? Now when I move this guy, you'll see there's this box highlighting all of them, right? And when I rotate it, I am rotating like all of the guys, right? So nodes in 3D work exactly the same way as they do in 2D. I must have pressed something. Whoa, what's happening? There we go. Okay. Nodes in 3D work exactly the same as 2D. Okay. And we have a lot of the same nodes that we do in 2D as we do in 3D. So we have sprites. We also have animated sprites 3D. These are really good for having two-dimensional things appear in space, almost like billboards or user interface and stuff. There's also lots of nodes for having three-dimensional shapes, which I'll show you in a minute. But we also have things like our audio listener, we have our camera 3D, we have collision shapes 3D, we have marker 3D, we have path 3D, we have, who else do we have? We have all of our fabled friends, right? We have, I don't know where area is, but we have an area 3D. Areas inside a collision object. Yeah, we have area 3D, we have character body 3D. Everybody who we're used to using in 2D also is going to be here in 3D, okay? But 3D is, as much as it's very similar, it's also pretty different from 2D in that, particularly in terms of the way we render it and show it out to the player, okay? So for instance, right, we have this 3D scene here, which is kind of nice. It has these two sort of flying robots in it. As a matter of fact, I'll just make them big, just for reference. So we have these two big old robots kind of hovering here in 3D space, right? This looks like a pretty good scene. I'm going to show you what it's like to render and start previewing a 3D scene. So I'm just going to go ahead and run the project. I'll select this current scene to be the main scene. I'll call this main, and I'll save it. And when we start it, just by rendering it, we just get this, we're confronted with this gray square, right? It's pretty odd, because we're not used to that with Godot. I mean, in our 2D scenes, right, if we had a 2D scene, and we just ran this as a blank 2D scene with nothing in it, that's kind of what it looks like. But there's a difference here between 2D and 3D scenes, which is that the 2D scene view always has a default camera window perspective, right? It always has a window that pops up and automatically renders this space here on screen, right? And if you use a camera 3D or 2D, it'll override that position, but by default we have this starting screen that we're drawing. 3D is different, right? Because 3D is inherently in the third dimension, and when we run the game, we're only rendering a 2D slice of the game, right? We're only rendering a specific 2D view. So in order for a 3D scene to get rendered to a 2D window, we have to flatten it down. We have to use a camera because we have to pick a perspective from which to view our 3D environment from, right? All games are flattened down to windows on your computer, And so in order to flatten the game down, the 3D environment down to a two-dimensional image, we need to now use a camera. Okay, so whereas cameras in 2D scenes are somewhat optional, cameras in 3D scenes are fundamental. You need a camera in a 3D scene. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add now a camera 3D. All right, so now you'll see we have a camera 3D. That's pretty good. And the camera 3D, you can kind of look at it like this, and you see that it has this little purple sort of like pyramid that extends from it, right? And this is the view, right? This is the view from the camera. As a matter of fact, if you want to preview the view from the camera, you can always click preview. And this is like the perspective from which you see things through the camera, okay? And so if I want to like change the perspective so I can include these robots, one thing I can do is I can just sort of rotate this camera around, and I can kind of look at it that way. And now if I hit preview, we see our robots here, so that's pretty good. So now I have successfully, I have a perspective through which I can view my scene, which is great. So I'm going to go ahead and try and run it and see if it prints out the image that I'm looking for. Okay, this sort of works, but not quite, right? This doesn't really look that good. Why is that? Well, for starters, we are missing we're missing a background, right? We're missing an environment, okay? And as a matter of fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new object called a, let's add a, I'll just add something called a CSG box. Okay, so you can just type in the word box or CSG box. And you'll see that we have now this 3D box here in our scene, which is kind of nice. And I'm just adding this because I want to show off a couple things that having a sprite doesn't really show you, right? So if we have this box here in this environment, we can see that it's lit up kind of nicely, right? It's got this shadow here and stuff. And if we click on the camera, we can see that it's there in the camera view. I'll even just rotate it slightly. So I'm going to click on the camera and hit preview, and you'll see we can see this box here with this shadow, this light and this shadow and all this stuff. But when we run our scene, we actually don't have any of that lighting information, okay? Even though these sprites are somewhat different, they're kind of like emitting their own sort of colors, but you can tell that when we just run a regular 3D scene, we don't have this environment, this really nice sort of background environment, and we don't have any light in our scene, okay? That's because in order for 3D scenes to properly work, we have to simulate a light source, right? Because the way that objects, the way that we perceive things in actual 3 dimensions, in real life, is that we, you know, the sun up in the sky, or a light bulb, or a flashlight or something, emits photons, right? Emits light rays, and these photons collide with actual objects in physical space, and they bounce off of them, and into our eyes, right? And it's through this act of things bouncing and absorbing different frequencies of light, and then bouncing back and registering that and hitting our eyes. That's how we perceive things. That's how we see objects. That's how we see color. That's how we see light and shadow and texture and all that. And so when we create things in 3D game engines, we have to simulate that as well. We have to have a light source that the computer simulates light rays emanating from, bouncing off of objects, and then bouncing into the camera. Okay, so the reason why we don't see anything back here or see any sort of depth or texture on our 3D object is because we don't have any light source. Now, you might be sort of wondering, well, why does it look this way in the viewport editor, right? How come there is a light source here? Clearly there is some sort of light bouncing off of this object, and we have this nice atmosphere and horizon. Godot does a nice job of giving you a default sort of preview environment so that you can just sort of look at stuff pretty quickly. Okay, if we look up here in the top bar, you'll see that we have this sun and this globe, and they are actually toggles. And if you toggle them off, you'll see that now we have this sort of flat preview environment without an atmosphere and without a light source, and that actually looks pretty similar to our rendering environment. Okay, so this is, if you want to see things without any sort of light source, you can always toggle them off. Conversely, if you want to quickly add these environments to your scene, you can click on these dots right up here. And you'll see up here we have this whole preview sun panel where we can mess with the preview sun, and we also have this preview environment. And we can mess with a lot of different little properties just right here. So for instance, I can change the color of the sky to like a purple. I can change the color of the ground to like maybe a green, maybe like a bright green or something. That's kind of fun. You can change the energy of the sky, right? This is kind of how bright the sun is in the sky. You can also apply some post-processing effects or whatever. And that's all kind of fun and games, but this is all still just the previewed environment, right? If we toggle it off, you'll see it's not actually added in our scene. So in order to add this preview environment to our scene, you then just go and click Add Environment to Scene. And you'll see that it creates a new node called a World Environment node. And the World Environment has an environment resource, and the environment resource has all these properties, which if you dig through, you'll sort of find all of the different properties. You'll find even more properties from the ones that you just set quickly up here, but you'll also see those properties that you set up there, right? So we have now like an environment. Let's also go ahead and add a sun, right? So you can change the color of the sun to like a wacky blue or something. And you'll see that now the light coming off of this object is blue because our light source is blue, right? And you can change the energy of the sun. You can make it sort of brighter and more intense, right? But for the sake of the rest of this tutorial, it's going to be helpful to have just a regular clear sun. That way we don't get confused. So I'm just going to go and reset this maybe down to like a regular old energy. And you can also change the angle of the sun, change all this sort of stuff. But then I'm just going to hit Add Sun to Scene, and you'll see that we added another node to our scene called a Directional Light 3D. And a Directional Light 3D is basically a sun, okay? It's a light source that is infinitely far away, and you can change the angle of it. So because the sun is infinitely far away, its position doesn't actually matter, right? It's so far away that the light source is going to come from this direction no matter where it is in your scene. The only thing that matters is actually the angle of the sun, okay? So I can change the rotation of the Directional Light 3D to change the way the light is sort of bounced around in this scene. But the position doesn't actually matter, okay? So again, these sort of nodes, these little like preview nodes here, they're good for adding a quick node to your scene, but these are also just regular nodes, okay? So if you want to, right, I deleted those and we still have our preview environment. You can also just go to the node tree and add a Directional Light 3D, and then we have a sun again, right? Same deal. And you'll see that it took away the sun option. And you can also add a environment, a world environment 3D. And the world environment requires an environment resource. And then the resource, you can really sort of get in here and mess around with a lot of different things. So for instance, you can change the mode to either be just like the background color, or you can make it a sky. And then if you want to make it a sky, you have to give it a sky. And all of these steps that I'm taking are like, they're done automatically by just instantiating the scene with the preview environment. So it's a nice way to do it. But if you want to add something like a custom skybox or a sky material, you can use these resources, these nodes to do that. But I'm just going to do a new procedural sky material, and then we're kind of back here at our default preview environment. Okay. You'll also notice that the world environment node is blue and red. That's because it's functional in both 2D and 3D games. So you can actually have a world environment for your 2D games, which is great for having things like special effects that you apply to things, fog, different sort of light tricks. So the world environment node is actually a multi-purpose node. Okay, so here we are, right? We have a camera, we have a light source, we have an object, and let's see if our scene actually looks the way we think it's going to look. Yes, it does. Look at that. That's amazing. So we get kind of one-for-one objects in our scene being rendered in real time. It's pretty cool. So from here, let's see. We've already sort of talked about sprite 2Ds. Typically, though, you know, sprite 2Ds are somewhat useful, but they're inherently two-dimensional, right? They're sort of flat. So it's more kind of interesting and exciting if we can start to use three-dimensional objects since we're creating 3D things. So I'm going to delete these sprite 2Ds, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this box, right? This CSG box. CSG stands for constructive solid geometry. What it basically means is these are sort of shapes that Godot has built in that you can use to sort of quickly prototype things. Okay, so like let's say you want to have like a floor or something. A really great way to quickly have a floor is to just make a big old box. So I'll actually start this process over again so we can sort of create it a little bit more correctly. I'm going to reset the position of my regular root node. I'm going to add now a CSG box. And you'll see that the CSG box has a size property. Okay, that's what you want to edit in order to actually change the size of your box. It's better to do that than the transformation property. And also, if you drag these handles on screen, you'll see that that's the property that those handles kind of automatically edit. Okay, so if you want to make something like a floor, an easy way to make a floor is to just make a box that is really big on the Z dimension and really big on the X dimension. Okay, and bing, bang, boom, Bob's your uncle. We have a floor. I'm going to rotate the sun a little bit to, let's see, get a little bit more light going on here. What's going on? Oh, it's pointing that way. I'm going to point it down that way. There we go. So there's a nice sun.